Um, Hopefully others will join us, but I'm glad to see, well, I guess I'm only seeing David, Zvi, and Chris, but I'm glad to have all of you here. I see Bobby and Sandy and David online. So this is the last in our series of studies of AI. I think that it's been a fascinating study, and a bit of a distraction, perhaps. Not always easy to be distracted, in the midst of all that's going on. But it's funny. I was talking with somebody the other day about this sermon and another sermon I gave at the High Holidays, and I was trying to even remember them. It's one thing if the congregation can't remember your sermon. It's a whole other thing if the rabbi can't remember what they said. Um, so it does feel like another world, but very interested in tonight's class. And I had put a question to David Svi, which it doesn't sound like we can incorporate in, but I mean, we've talked about it a little bit about not only the question of can AI be human or a person and all those rights and stuff like that, but the biases that is either programmed in or that develop, I don't want to say naturally, but maybe organically, but that's probably the same thing, has just come up in a couple of articles that I've read lately. Anyhow, David Svi, thank you for spending another evening with us, and I turn it over to you.
It's a pleasure to be with you all again. Um, I'll say a little bit more about this at the end, but I want to start by just giving a little bit of a sense of where I see this kind of work in relationship to the events unfolding in Israel right now, because I'm also distracted. I think we're all distracted by the current events, and I think there is this big question hanging over discussions like this that I think can at times feel frivolous or kind of luxurious. Like, there's people just talking about hostages, and we're talking about artificial intelligence and robots and things like that. Why? Um, I think the inclination of a lot of people within Jewish communities is to treat subjects like this, any subjects that are not directly about kind of the future continuity of the Jewish people, the future health of the state of Israel, things like that, as in some ways being marginal, as in some ways being of lesser importance. And while I certainly don't want to imply that the current conversations that we're having around the needs of the moment are important or not deserved, because they certainly are important and deserved. I also think it is important to not leave aside these issues, and actually that these issues, in the long history of what Judaism is going to become, are quite central. Um, they are not marginal at all. And in fact, if what Judaism imagines itself as being a religion that it cares about morality, that is a moral force in the world, then treating these issues as marginal is basically a recipe to become irrelevant. Um, because if you don't have what to say about the moral issues of the day, the moral issues that people care about, then basically you end up just talking to yourself about legacy topics. And I think that's insufficient. I think there has to be more than that. And that involves bringing Judaism, growing Judaism into new areas that it has not previously been in, and that is hard to do. It's hard to do in part because Jewish people are getting attacked, and Israel is in a war, and those are not small things, and it is hard to pay attention to both things at the same time. But I think part of what it means to have a robust and healthy Jewish people is that we are capable of having both short-term and long-term conversations at the same time, that it is essential that we do so, and that we treat these things as of equal importance. And these both are necessary for the development, the future growth of the Jewish people. I don't think the Jewish people, I don't think our story is anywhere close to over. I think we are closer to the beginning of Jewish history than to its end. And because of that, doing this groundwork of thinking through, well, how do we think about the development of new technologies is actually essential to what I imagine it is going to be, what it will become to be a Jewish person going forward. So I really want us to get out of the mindset of this is being marginal or extra or special in some ways. I know, like, believe me, I do this all the time. Like, I think this is my bread and butter, so I hear that stuff all the time, but it's really not that. It really has to be something beyond that. Um, And with that in mind, I want us to talk today about one area where I think Judaism has something really essential to say about artificial intelligence. Um, I think in general, I'm very skeptical. I expressed this in our first class. I'm very skeptical of people who put forward the idea that, of course, Judaism is what to say about artificial intelligence. Of course, Judaism is what to say about virtual reality or whatever other new technology comes down the pipe. I think there's a kind of arrogance around suggesting that Judaism already knows what it thinks about the topics of the day. And that arrogance leads to a kind of diminishment of creativity because it's like, well, oh, of course the texts are already there. So what's the point of actually putting in the work and figuring out what we think? And with regard to artificial intelligence in particular, I don't know that Judaism has what to say about everything, at least not yet. But there is one area where I think Judaism already has a well-developed position that is of great use to the current conversations around artificial intelligence, and that is around how do we think about AI as being a person and what rights should be bestowed upon AI, depending on how we think about it as a person. But to get into that conversation, I kind of want to frame it in terms of a couple of other conversations. So there is a conversation we're having today around AI personhood. And to give you a sense of what I mean by AI personhood, let's think for a second about a couple of years ago, there was a Google engineer named Blake Lemoine. Blake was in conversation with a very advanced chatbot, and in the course of the conversation, he became convinced that this chatbot was sentient in some way. Because it was sentient, it had rights. And so he started saying, hey, this chatbot deserves a lawyer. Someone please give this chatbot a lawyer. I think he got kind of laughed out of the room. But those questions linger. To what degree should AI be treated like a person? And if we treat an AI like a person, then what rights go along with that? Critically, it is not just in the conversations around AI that we are speaking about personhood. We speak about personhood in other contexts in Western society as well. Anybody want to venture a guess? Where are some other places we talk about personhood? And I don't mean personhood in terms of like a legal idea, meaning we can talk about corporate personhood, which is a legal concept, but it doesn't correspond. No one thinks like a corporation is like a living, breathing person. It exists for some kind of statutory purposes, but not beyond that. There are other areas where we actually are thinking about personhood as being an idea that we would apply to something that is not a human being. What might those be?
I mean, the first one that comes to mind is the question of, an unborn child, a fetus, that, that question of if that's what you're talking about.
Great. Fetuses. That's one. There's one other that we commonly talk about. Roberta, did you want to jump in?
There's one area of conversation going on right now with the Aboriginal communities, and that's whether rivers and lakes and natural have personhood sorts of rights, and it's quite shocking when you compare it to a corporation. If a corporation does and a river can't, but I know that that's something that's going on.
Great. Okay. So these are the two areas. Thinking about animals or even natural objects as having personhood and thinking about fetuses as personhood. So let's just kind of explore those each for a second. So a couple years ago, there was a situation at the Bronx Zoo. The Bronx Zoo has an elephant named Happy. Happy the elephant shows demonstrably some amount of self-awareness. And there was a group that attempted to kind of remove Happy from the Bronx Zoo to some better environment by making the argument that Happy is a person. And as a person, it has the right of habeas corpus. It is being, improperly contained in the Bronx Zoo and should be able to go somewhere else. Now, I should say the judge who looked at this case said, no, this is not going to fly. This is not a person. That being said, there are other jurisdictions where bodies of water, rivers, lakes, mountains do have some kind of rights in and of themselves. And so the idea that a kind of personhood would be attributed to something that is not a human being, and it's perhaps not even living in a kind of in the same way that a human being is alive, is developing, and I think has real weight. So that is one conversation we're having right now. The other conversation is around fetal personhood. Now, I'll say, like, I don't know what the politics of this is in Canada right now. I recently spoke about this at Lee Mood in the UK. And when I introduced the concept of fetal personhood, everyone was like, what in the world are you talking about? Because the politics of abortion in the UK are different from what they are in the US. In the US, I can tell you that after the overturning of Roe, one of the mechanisms that more conservative states have been using in order to quickly restrict the right to abortion has been, instead of directly speaking to abortion, making the claim that actually a fetus is a person. And as a person, it has many of the rights that a born person would have, including obviously the right to not be killed. And so it is a legal stratagem. I don't say this to say that the people putting this forward, this argument, don't also believe that it is true. I think some of them do believe it is true. That being said, the way in which this notion of fetal personhood is applied is uneven. Most famously, it's a little bit funny, is an example in Texas. So Texas does have a notion of fetal personhood that's on the books. And there was a woman in Texas who recently made the claim she was in the HOV lane, or the high occupancy vehicle lane, normally reserved for, like, you were traveling with one or two passengers next to you. This is one person, a pregnant woman, made the claim, hey, I can be in the HOV lane because it is me and my fetus. If the fetus is a person, it should count as a person for the purposes of HOV lane occupancy. This did not work. And I think we can ask reasonably, why didn't this not work? And are the ways that we talk about personhood always consistent? And what I think we will find when we talk about artificial intelligence and personhood is that the category itself of personhood is not necessarily the best way to think about the ways in which we treat AIs or animals or bodies of water or fetuses as people. And in fact, we need some better tools. And I think Judaism actually has some useful tools to provide. The reason, though, that we do end up in this personhood idea is because personhood is very much connected to the idea of ensoulment. It really comes out of a Christian context that to be a person is to have a soul. And if you either have a soul or you don't. And if you have a soul, then there's this whole list of rights and responsibilities that accrue. And if you don't, then they don't accrue. So it is relatively binary. I think the Jewish tradition, this is a good example where it's not like anybody in the Jewish tradition was kind of setting out to make this case. But I think if you look collectively at all the places where you have examples of these like liminal entities, not human beings, but something that is humanoid, we might say, they suggest a different kind of approach and one that is actually very, very helpful. Before we get to that, I want to kind of go to the kind of the typical way in which the question of AI personhood is discussed, which is to ask the question, well, if you want to claim that an AI is a person, then you need to ask, does the AI act in some ways? Is it like me in some essential way? So we might ask, is it capable of thought? This has been a question around artificial intelligence for decades, even before artificial intelligence was viable. The question of whether a computer thinks, whether its internal processes are analogous to our own in various ways. One of the most famous examples of like how to think this through is in a classic philosophical thought experiment called the Chinese room. It doesn't actually need to be Chinese. It can be any kind of language which you don't speak. And the setup for the room is basically you have a person in the room. They have a kind of a book that contains inputs and outputs. If you have this kind of input, give this output. The inputs and outputs are in Chinese. This person does not speak Chinese, but they do know how to look up items in the book. Now, all day coming to this room are people who are kind of sending in messages in Chinese. This person then finds, matches up those messages, figures out what the correct output is, and then puts that output on the outside. So if you are not sitting inside this room, you have no idea what's going on inside this room. You're just kind of seeing people put in these cogent, coherent Chinese messages, and then reasonable Chinese messages come out on the other side. You might say, oh, well, there is clearly an intelligent Chinese speaker who is sitting in this room. And of course, the person who put forward this argument would claim, actually, no, it's clearly not the case. And instead, what is going on is there's some other process happening, but it is not a thought process. It is some kind of lookup process. Now, there are all kinds of critiques of this proposal, which I don't want to get into. What I want to show you here is just that one way to approach this question is by asking it as a kind of philosophical question. The other thing that happens, though, as we develop better and better in AIs is, on the one hand, sometimes we try to say, like, well, does the AI match up with what we do? But sometimes what happens is the existence of these sophisticated machines that seem to be doing what human beings can do, but are not human, actually make us reevaluate who we are. This was already happening way, way, way before AI with the invention of mechanical clocks and all kinds of sophisticated automata, mechanical devices. People started seeing, rulers, noblemen were able to create these devices that look like human beings, but just can contain kind of intricate mechanisms, machinery on the inside, and started thinking, wait a minute, if we are capable of doing such things with machines, then how are we certain that we are not machines, that we are not just more sophisticated versions of these things we are creating? So on the one hand, these kind of comparisons can be used to diminish, to draw into question the kind of thoughtfulness of a artificial intelligence. On the other hand, it can be used to diminish our own thoughtfulness by saying, well, if an AI can do such things without claiming to have sentience, without claiming to have thought, maybe our own claims to having sentience, to having thought, are just illusions that we have projected onto ourselves. And in fact, we're just sophisticated machines. Oh, this is Rene Descartes made this argument that actually animals are really just sophisticated machines, and other people said like, well, animals are sophisticated machines. Maybe people are also sophisticated machines. So the reason that this matters is that the stakes are actually quite high. Because once you have an entity like an AI that is capable of doing something like what a human being can do without being a human, then you can easily start asking the question, well, maybe human beings ought not to be treated with respect because we are just really just machines of a sort. And so this is not just a theoretical question, it has real implications for human beings as well. So the question is, how would the Jewish tradition deal with this issue? And I want to put forward that there is a pretty consistent approach within the Jewish tradition for how do you deal with entities that are not human, but seem human-like in some ways. And I want to show you 3 examples of that come from wildly different areas of Jewish thought. The first has to do with monkeys or some kind of primate. It's a little bit unclear what it's talking about. So there is in the Mishnah, written in the 3rd century, there is this incredibly vast literature around ritual purity and impurity. You don't really need to know anything about that right now, beyond the idea that within the Jewish tradition, a human corpse has a kind of inherent impurity. And that impurity is specific to human dead bodies and is not contained with non-human dead bodies. That being said, there is one Mishnah, there is one verse that suggests something different. And it is speaking about this animal called the Adon Hasadeh. It's a little bit unclear what kind of animal this is, but it seems like it's some kind of orangutan, perhaps. In this Mishnah, it says a wild man-like creature is in the category of chaya. That piece doesn't matter as much. Rabbi Yossi says they cause impurity in a tent like a human being. That is to say, if you encountered this orangutan, the corpse of an orangutan in a field, that animal has the status of a human being as far as ritual impurity. Now, just like pause for a second and think about why this might be. It's probably not because this animal is a thinking being, because it is a sentient being. It is probably something much more visceral. It is this being sufficiently resembles a human, and because it resembles a human, my immediate emotional response to that being is, oh my goodness, I'm seeing a dead body in the street. I'm seeing a dead body on the road. I need to treat it with respect. And so because of that superficial resemblance, I have responsibility to treat this being like a human, at least for this situation. I think what's important here is that there is no claim being made about the overall personhood of orangutans. It is just about this instance. And I'll say that overall, within the rabbinic tradition, whenever rabbis come across questions of, is such and such thing a person, they don't really try to address that globally. Instead, they're interested in addressing specific cases. So for example, one of the reasons that there is so much debate about exactly what rabbis think about abortion is that rabbis don't approach this from their Christian perspective of like, when does life begin? It doesn't quite work like that within Jewish thought. Instead, there's all these much smaller questions. There's questions about, does a fetus inherit property? Does the presence of a fetus inside its parent's womb, does that affect the ways that the parent is or is not able to eat certain kind of ritual foods? Because these like very, very specific questions. And that is helpful because the truth of the matter is when you're dealing with something that is kind of liminal, it's like on the border of what we would consider a person, it is actually more helpful to think about smaller cases than to try to make broad claims and then kind of have these awkward conversations around like, how do you fit this broad notion of personhood into something that is not quite a person in the way that you would imagine. So having these smaller conversations is actually more helpful in these situations. let me show you one other example, and then let's pause. The second example is not about orangutans. It's about a conversation which you probably didn't even know rabbis had anything to say about, which is the existence of extraterrestrial life. You might think, what, Judaism have what to say about extraterrestrial life? It's like one of those issues where, if the sources hadn't been there, you might not know that they existed, or you might think like this is totally out of the realm of Jewish thought. But the truth of the matter is, there is a long-standing conversation, not just within Jewish thought, but within Christian thought, within Greek philosophy, about the existence of life on other planets. And the reason that conversation exists is that it has an impact on how you think about God and God's capacity to create variations in the world, difference in the world, and the significance of human life. So there is a Greek debate. That Greek debate then gets inherited by Christians. And within Christianity, there is a major dispute. Many people weigh in on this, but in the 13th century, there's a dispute between Thomas Aquinas on the one hand and the Bishop of Rome on the other hand. Thomas Aquinas has the perspective of there can only be one world. There can't be other planets. There can't be life on other planets. No way. And the reason there can't be life on other planets is because God is perfect. And if God is perfect, then having life on other planets is a way of saying that the universe is chaotic and God just doesn't tolerate chaos. And so to suggest that there is life on other planets actually is a kind of offensive or abhorrent to the notion of a perfect God. So that's Aquinas. On the other hand, you have the Bishop of Rome. And the Bishop of Rome basically says, Thomas Aquinas, what you said is heretical. And the reason it's heretical is because if you believe that God is perfect, and if you believe that God is omnipotent, then to suggest that God can't do something, like can't make infinite worlds, can't make infinite species, infinite intelligences, that is actually heretical. So on the one hand, you have Aquinas saying, no, God's essence requires that there's only one world. On the other hand, you have the Bishop of Rome saying, no, God's essence requires that there be infinite worlds. Now, Jews weigh in on this debate. They're weighing on both sides, but the overwhelming weight of Jewish opinion is on the side of the Bishop of Rome to say that, of course, sure, there can be other planets. Sure, there can be other worlds. In fact, one of the most beautiful ways this was put was by a guy named Yosef Shlomo del Medigo. Yosef Shlomo del Medigo is the student of Galileo. Galileo had a bunch of students. One of them is Jewish, possibly invented the thermometer. A little bit unclear how that worked. But Galileo himself was a little bit on the fence about whether there could be life on other planets. Del Medico is like, of course, this is great. I'm so happy to hear there can be life on other planets. In fact, there's a bunch of rabbinic sources that suggest that God made all these fancy worlds. And, isn't it great that it's now being verified by empirical science? But the person who I think put this best is a little known poet, Provençal poet named Yadayahu Badersi. Let me pull up what he has to say. I think he says this so nicely. Yadayahu ben Avram Badersi, he writes, the heavenly spheres were not formed to serve these perishable creatures, for they are more glorious than them. It is far from the design of the Creator to humble those exalted ones to the vile and abject, the immortal to them that perish. For who will imagine that a wise manufacturer would prepare tools worth 10,000 talents to form an iron needle? I love that last line. Who would imagine that a wise manufacturer would prepare tools worth 10,000 talents to form an iron needle? There's something in that line that reminds me of like Carl Sagan and Cosmos. Like the universe is so vast and like we're just this small piece of it. We're this like iron needle in this like massive universe. And like, of course there's more to it than just us. The reason I'm showing this to you is because I think one of the things that frightens us often when we think about AI as being a person, AI as having personhood is, well, what does that do to us? Does that mean that humanity's personhood is diminished? And I think this is like a serious question, right? We have a notion in Judaism that human beings are created in the image of God. Human beings are created in the image of God, and because of that, they have a kind of special, perhaps infinite value, right? To destroy one human being is to destroy the entire world, as the rabbis say. But that question of why human beings have that value and what does it mean to be created in the image of God is a little bit vague, is a little bit loose. And I think many of us kind of organically come to the ideal that, well, what it means to be created in the image of God is the human beings are different. They're different from all other kinds of animals, right? We can make tools and we can speak and we can reason in different kinds of ways. We can make art, all these different things. And so we are different. And so we come to this kind of informal equation between human uniqueness, human value. Humans are valuable because humans are unique. The problem is that AI kind of takes that equation and messes it up because AI is on this rampage of basically taking all the things that human beings imagined made them unique and just saying for all those things, actually, no, I can do that too, right? 25 years ago, human beings were the only ones who could like play chess competitively. Now AIs can beat and even the best chess player in the world, right? Human beings thought they were the only ones who could write essays or make paintings or write music or all the rest. Turns out AI can do all those things. And yes, we can quibble about like whether AI is doing it originally or not. But I think viscerally for many of us, there is that feeling of, wait a minute, something has changed. There's a kind of queasiness that comes with, I thought I understood what it meant to be human, and now my understanding is diminished because of all these differences, because of all these changes. That is really disconcerting. And I think it can impact the way we think about humans as having value, right? There was a notion called the God of the Gaps, right? The God of the Gaps is the idea that, like, if you're trying to reconcile science and religion, well, God is in all the places that science can't explain yet. I think one of the things that AI does is it creates a kind of humans of the gaps problem, where the way we imagine ourselves as being human beings is really tied to the things that AI can't do yet. And I think that's probably not the best situation to be in. And I think one way to avoid it is by pointing out that within the Jewish tradition, it's actually not important that human beings be unique. There's no reason to suggest that human beings need to be unique to be important. Human value is axiomatic. Human beings have a value regardless of whether they are unique. I think Badersi claims this. You see this in other sources as well. But human uniqueness is not essential. Now, divine uniqueness is, right? There is only one God. Jews are pretty clear about that. There's only one God. But that there can be only one kind of sentient, rational species, a little bit less clear about that. And I think in this present moment, it's helpful to imagine that we are going to need to separate out that notion of human value from human uniqueness and really insist that human beings do have that value, even if they cannot demonstrate that they are superior to AIs in various ways. Because we certainly don't want to end up in a situation where people have to demonstrate their own humanity or demonstrate their own value in order to achieve respect within society. I think that's a dangerous path to go down. Let me pause there for a second and just ask if there's questions about anything that I've said so far.
I don't think so, but keep going. It's very fascinating.
Okay. I want to show you one more example. Last example is not about orangutans and it's not about aliens. It's about, honestly, if the rabbis of the Talmud were alive today and they saw AIs, they wouldn't say, oh, my go-to metaphor for AI is a golem. The rabbis in the Talmud didn't know about golems. They would say, the AIs remind me of nothing so much as demons. And let me just say a little bit about what I mean about demons. In the rabbinic imagination, or I should say in the rabbinic world, the rabbis imagine that demons are real, full stop. They're not like fantastical beings. They're just as real as you and me. They're just as real as fetuses. They're just around. And they're not the only ones who think that, right? Zoroastrians, Christians, everyone is basically convinced that demons are real. But Jews have a special problem because if you're a Zoroastrian, if you're a Christian, and you say that their demons are real, well, what motivates demons? For Christians and Zoroastrians, it's some kind of demonic force, right? For Christians, what motivates demons is the devil. For Zoroastrians, what motivates demons is the Ahriman, the kind of the evil deity. But Jews don't have one of those. They just have one God that is responsible for everything. So the rabbis have this kind of like intellectual problem, and the scholar Sarah Ronas has kind of like really spelled this out quite well. The problem is the rabbis on the one hand believe demons are real, and on the other hand, they don't have a good explanation for why demons do what they do. So the rabbinic answer is basically, well, maybe demons are just kind of around. They're just like doing their business. They're, sometimes they're capricious, sometimes they hurt people. Some they have their own rules of conduct. They know about God, certainly they're in conversation with God sometimes. But basically, the rabbis, because they don't have a devil, need to bestow upon demons some measure of free will. And what that means is that in the rabbinic imagination, you have a world that's basically occupied by these two autonomous species, human beings and demons, and they both live in the world together. Now, the rabbis also have a kind of question of like, well, then where do demons sit in relationship to human beings? Are they like us? Are they not like us? In some rabbinic stories, actually, demons are descended from humans, right? Demons are descended from the progeny of Adam, or it's a little bit complicated, but in different stories, there's different origins. But in any event, you have demons living around the world. So the rabbis actually are quite clear about how they imagine demons in relationship to human beings, and they spell it out. That's what they say. And I'll say just for this in this image, if you haven't seen this already, these are fascinating. On the left is a bowl. From the era of the Talmud, Babylonian Talmud, we have very few pieces of evidence of Jewish life outside of the Talmud itself, with the one exception of archaeological evidence and these bowls. These bowls were planted, they were kind of buried upside down, often near the entrances of houses. They contain spiraling writing. It's usually writing in Aramaic with the figure often of a demon in the middle of them, and they are basically written as a way to ward off demons. They're kind of early amulets. They often contain verses. Sometimes they're written in the form of divorce documents, as this demon is divorced from me or my household or whatever else it is. But just to kind of give you an example of how real the rabbis imagine these things as being. Anyways, so there is a rabbinic text of what's Rabbi Natan, and I should say this text appears in other versions elsewhere. It says, 6 things were said about humans. Humans are like animals in 3 ways, and they're like ministering angels in 3 ways. How are they like animals? Well, they eat and drink, and they procreate, and they excrete like animals. How are they like ministering angels? They have wisdom, they walk upright, they speak the holy tongue like angels. Now, how about demons? Demons are like humans in 3 ways, and they're like ministering angels in 3 ways. They're like humans because they eat and drink, they procreate, and they die like humans. They're like ministering angels because they have wings, they know the future, and they go from one end of the world to the other like ministering angels. They are some who say they can also change their appearance to anything they wish and can become invisible. That is to say, the rabbis are not trying to answer this broad question of are demons people or not? Instead, they are content to simply say, here are the ways that they're like people, here are the ways that they're not. And it doesn't need to go beyond that, because trying to come up with these broader terms actually risks saying too much. And so the rabbis would rather say too little than to say too much. I think between these 3 texts, this text about demons, the text about extraterrestrial life, and the text about orangutans, you start to develop a notion of how the rabbis might respond to the presence of artificial intelligence, which is to say, first of all, it is not a threat to us. It is not a threat to our notion of human value. We should be open to the idea that they could be treated like persons in some circumstances, and we should care more about the specific circumstances than this broad question of is it a person or is not. And then also, I think most importantly, there is a heuristic that comes out of this, and the heuristic is, if something presents itself to you like a person, treat it like a person, right? To go back to this text, if a being seems like a person, treat it like a person. And I think as a heuristic, that is incredibly helpful, right? It's helpful in part because it allows us to avoid a major problem that a lot of us worry about confronting. And I'll show you what this problem looks like with a specific text. Look at the image on the right. So the image on the right does not correspond to a real human being. This is made by an AI. It's photorealistic. But I think because it's a human face, there is a kind of automatic response that you have when you look at faces like this. And that response is good, right? It's good for us to respond to people and have some sense of responsibility towards them. In fact, it's so important that there's a philosopher, Emmanuel Levinas, who made the claim that all of morality springs from encounters with faces like this. But Levinas is a philosopher who lives, who is writing after the Holocaust, and he is a philosopher of ethics. And he is trying to figure out how, in the wake of the Holocaust, do I find a foundation, a reason for people to be ethical? Well, it can't be God, because it's after the Holocaust, and we don't trust God to be a source of ethics anymore. So instead, it's got to be something else. What he says is actually ethics comes from other people. Ethics comes from the encounter with another person, and specifically an encounter with that person's face. What Levinas writes is, and he writes this in many places, the first word of the face is, thou shalt not kill. It is an order. There is a commandment in the appearance of the face, as if a master spoke to me. However, at the same time, the face of the other is destitute. It is the poor for whom I can do all and to whom I owe all. That is to say, there is something that happens in an encounter with some other face that demands something of us. It demands a kind of respect, at least the respect of don't harm this person. And from that, all other ethics flows. So with AIs, you have a kind of question, which is, well, what do you do with faces like this? Because faces like this could very realistically erode that relationship. Because it used to be that I look at faces like this and I say, well, it's a human face. I have to respect it. But now, before I ask that question, I have another question. Before I say that, I have a question. And that question is, but is it a real face? Is this really a real person? And if it's not, do I owe it respect? And do I err on the side of don't treat it like a person until it demonstrates affirmatively to me that it is a person, or err on the side of more humanity, more personhood? And I think the rabbinic response is actually quite clear. The rabbinic response is err on the side of more personhood. If something presents itself as a person, treat it like a person. Because it is way, way, way worse to end up in a situation where you are treating a human being as having less value than they really should have, than to accidentally give an AI more value than it should. Now, the reason I want to present it this way is that this is radically different from like the questions that we see here around like the Chinese room, right? This is an attempt to answer the question of, is an AI a person philosophically? I honestly think that's a bad idea. I think it's the wrong tool, because we can spend forever and a day asking whether an AI really thinks. What does it mean to think? And we can ask, well, in what ways are AIs and people similar in terms of their emotions and in terms of their interiority, sense of self, all the rest? Like, great, we can ask those questions. But at the end of the day, there's a kind of practical concern, which is like, how do I treat people? And how do I treat the AIs in my life? And I think for that, the simple heuristic of treat something like a person, if it presents itself like a person, is the way to go. Now, I should say this is a two-way street, because part of what that means is if I go through the world saying, if something presents itself to me as a person, I'm going to treat it like a person. Part of what that means is that the companies developing these AIs should not be spending their time trying to fool me, should not be spending their time trying to constantly trick me into thinking that I'm talking to people when in fact I'm talking to AIs, because that can erode my sense of what is a person. So I think part of this heuristic, also part of the kind of corollary to this heuristic, is the idea that the developers of AI technologies cannot fool people, or should not be in the business of fooling people into treating something like people, treating someone like a person, tricking someone in ways that they do not want to be tricked. And in terms of AI regulation, I think that's also a very clear directive. Now, this is all well and good, but I want to just kind of like be honest about where the tradition goes with this. So the Jewish tradition, I think in general, does have this idea that humanity is bestowed in accordance with the way it's exhibited, right? If something appears more human, treat it more like a person. I should say the other way around. If something appears more like a person, treat it like a human. That can also be taken in the other direction. And I want to show you some examples of this. The first example is to note that is over here. So there are times that the rabbis say, yes, if something seems more like a person, treat it more like a person. But sometimes the rabbis say, if something is human but seems really, really inhuman, maybe don't treat it like a human. So a good example of this is in the rabbinic conversations around what to do with, I think what we would call early stage fetuses. There was a case of a woman from Sidon who gave birth to a likeness of a raven 3 times, and the case came before the sages, and they said, anything that does not have a human form is not offspring. So this woman is giving birth probably to an early stage fetus. It does not look like a person. It looks more like a bird than it does like a person. And because of that, the rabbis say, well, it doesn't appear to me like my instinct when I look at this organism, my instinct is not, oh, this is a person. And because that's not my instinct, legally, it is not a person. It is not treated like a person for all kinds of various purposes. I think it is very easy for this kind of reasoning to go off the rails and be quite damaging. Just to give you an example of this, where we actually do see this happening, is in one of the earliest rabbinic texts that thinks about can a golem count in a minyan? And I should say Jacob Emden is a really interesting person to ask this question, because Emden actually had a family tradition that his grandfather employed a golem in his household. Like that, there was a family tradition that golems are real. Our grandfather had a golem, so he writes about that and as part of that family tradition. And so he says, no, a golem can't be part of a minyan, can't join a minyan. Why? Well, For the same reason that other kinds of imperfect humans can join a minyan. He says a deaf mute, a mentally incapable person, and a child don't count for a minyan, just like a golem, even though they're Jews and are regarded as Jewish in every respect except for observance of the commandments, and one who kills them is culpable, right? So if you kill them, you're liable, just like if you kill a golem according to Emden, you're liable. But it's thus hardly necessary to state that this man, created by Rabbi, this is a reference to an early golem, does not count for a minyan since he has no intelligence whatsoever. It was as if they trained dogs to go on an errand. Rabbi sent this man, his life is like the life of an animal. He is no more than an animal in human shape. So basically saying, listen, a golem is not going to count in a minyan, basically because it's not a full human, right? If you imagine human beings are judged on the kind of rubric of like how close are you to being an adult human male, um, that's going to leave a lot of people in various states of inhumanity, and I think that's dangerous as well. The last caution to give comes from the world of disability, and here I want to show you a text and a critique of that text given by Julie Watts-Belzer. The text is from Leviticus 21. And it's a part of the Bible which like maybe we don't look at so much. This is about who is qualified, which priests are qualified to serve in the temple, right? So like priests in general, their jobs are all around temple service, but only certain priests actually get to serve like in the kind of very public facing temple positions. And the Bible says, actually, there are rules about who can serve in those positions, and the rules are based on what your body looks like. So looking just at the bold part, no one at all who has a defect should be qualified. No man who is blind, lame, has a limb too short or too long. No man who has a broken leg or a broken arm, or who has a hunchback or a dwarf who has a growth in his eye, who has a boil scar, scurvy, or crushed testes, right? So there's this whole list of people whose bodies are, let's say, quote unquote, imperfect, quote unquote, abnormal in some way. And because of that, the Torah says, actually, those people don't get to serve in the temple. When you go to the temple, you don't want to see people who look weird in these various ways. And so we actually prevent those people from serving in the temple. Now, this is problematic because it sets up a notion of what a normal human being looks like. But beyond that, like there's a kind of theological problem here, which is, the reason that you want certain kinds of people serving in the temple is that they are kind of your conduits to God. And to suggest that these people can't be your conduits to God, I think says something more about like where they sit in relationship to this notion of like the divine image. Maybe this text is saying something like, well, if your limbs are too short, you're not really made in the divine image. You're not made in the divine image in the same way. And I think that's a kind of dangerous road to go down. Julie Watts-Belzer, and I actually highly recommend this book. It just came out a few months ago, and it's an attempt to kind of think through notion of disability with Jewish sources. She talks about this text in particular and says something I think, which is like, I think maybe we should say more often, which is, sometimes people look at problematic Jewish texts and say like, oh, let me find a way to make this work. She says, you know what? This text is just not going to work. This is an offensive text. Full stop. Right? She says at the end of this, how do you reconcile that text? She wanted to know. My answer was blunt. I don't. Look at the second paragraph. My goal isn't to gentle these ancient worlds or to soften their sting. I'm not interested in apologizing for this text or reconciling with my values. Instead, I prefer to face Leviticus 21 as a powerful and disturbing text, one that makes visible the dynamics by which certain bodies are marked as inferior. I take these biblical words as a visceral reminder of the brutal power of ableism. I hold them as a witness to the deep disdain for disabled people that runs through so much of our histories, our cultures, our sacred narratives. I flat out don't believe that these verses tell the truth of God's desire. But I do believe this passage is a powerful testament to the way that humans have imagined God in our own image, the way we have endowed God with our own prejudice. So her way of resolving this is to say, like, this isn't actually what God wanted. This is what human beings projected onto God, human beings with their own bias. Fine. The reason that I want to make sure you're seeing these texts as well is because I don't want to present a kind of triumphalist notion of like Judaism is what to say about AI, and it is this new perspective on personhood, and it is perfect and well-formed, and there's no problems with it. No. The Jewish perspective that I'm approaching, improperly applied, has pretty negative implications. And those implications are just as if something presents itself more like a human, treat it more like a person, the reverse is also true. If a human being presents as less than human, that person loses some of their personhood as well. And I think that is a really dangerous road to go down. So I don't want to apply this kind of like mechanically. I think half of this is worth applying, the part that expands the notion of personhood to include AIs in some circumstances, but the part that subtracts it, the part that says actually human beings do need to meet a minimum threshold, or actually human beings need to be perfectly shaped in order to have full personhood, full citizenship. I am not comfortable with that, and so I'm only applying half of this and not the other half. The last piece of this that I want us to look at together, and then I'll go to questions, is less about the notion of personhood itself and is more thinking about where these AIs sit as part of our society overall. Because I think, AI, artificial intelligences, are often seen not just as the project of individual companies, but as kind of human projects, right? They are in some ways a way for us to measure where we stand as a species, right? We are now a species that is capable of producing machines that can replicate many of our own behaviors, and that's an important status. And we have these big grand conversations around like what are the rights of AIs and things like that. And look, those questions I think we'll continue to talk about. They show up in various ways. They will show up in more. I think those are questions that are going to hit home more once AIs become more individuated, right? Like when you talk to ChatGPT right now, you and everyone else talking to it are basically talking to the same model, but it's not a model that has a physical form. It's not a model that really remembers you from session to session. Once you have more individual AIs, that may be a different conversation. But the other piece of this is that these AIs also exist as the product of companies. And those companies often present themselves as in some ways being representatives of humanity overall. And they often speak in those terms. They'll say, this is not just my project, this is humanity's project, when actually it's a small group of people in Silicon Valley often who are making these things. This problem, the idea that you have human outputs, sophisticated human outputs that are presented as being for everyone, but are actually just for a few people, this is a very old problem. And I want to show you a little bit about the kind of the critique that already exists within the Jewish tradition around this problem. The best way to look at this is the story of the Tower of Babel. Tower of Babel being kind of the first monumental human project. There is this amazing midrash about the Tower of Babel, and the midrash goes like this. So the people come and they all, contribute to the tower, and then Rabbi Pinchas says, just looking at the last few lines here, if a man fell and died, they paid no heed to him. But if a brick fell, they sat down and wept, and they said, woe is us. When will another one come in instead? That is to say, they care more about bricks than they do about people. People are expendable, bricks are not. And the question that I have around this text is, it says that if a man falls down and dies, they pay no heed to him. Who's the they in that sentence? Who's the they who pays no heed? And I think there's actually a really good answer to this question. And we can get to that answer not by looking at any texts, but by looking at a series of pictures. Now, the great thing about biblical illustrations is that, just speaking as a historian of science, one of the best ways to learn, or not one of the best, one way to learn about technologies of the past, technologies that would not otherwise have been documented, is by looking at Bibles, right? If you look at pictures of the Tower of Babel, you can often see what medieval people imagined cranes looked like, what medieval cranes looked like, because they're used in the construction of the tower. They're actually in this picture. They're very small. You may not be able to see them. The same is true for boats. If you want to learn about ancient boat building, shipbuilding, look at Noah's Ark, because Noah's Ark has lots of pictures of ships being built. And one thing that we notice when we look at pictures of Noah's Ark in Bibles across the Middle Ages is that the way in which they're constructed changes over time, and it becomes more sophisticated. I promise this will link back up to something important in a second. When you start seeing boats being built, boats are being built in a kind of pretty primitive way. You start by originally the way boats are built is you start with a kind of internal structure. You figure out what you want the inside of the boat to look like. You build that, and then you coat the outside of the boat with something that's waterproof. The advantage to building a boat like that is that it requires less preparation. The disadvantage is that your external structure is not going to be streamlined for the water. It's really just being built around the internal needs. The better way to build a boat is to design from the start what you want the whole thing to look like and then execute on that. And so instead of building from the inside out, building just first the decks and then the waterproof exterior. You start by building the outer skeleton, and then you fill in the decks. So that makes for better ships, but it is also much harder to execute. It requires planning. It requires like a team to develop it. And you can see the transition from one form of shipbuilding to the other in both Christian and Jewish art around the tower, around Noah's Ark. So take a look at this picture. This is from a 13th century Bible. Noah's on the left. Jesus is on the right. Noah's building the boat. He seems pretty unhappy about it, frankly. And it's just him by himself. Now, in later depictions, you have other people as well. So here you have Noah. He's a little bit hard to see, which is actually kind of the point. He is the one who's on the boat in the blue with a hammer in his hand. Notice that Noah is part of this process, but he has lots of people helping him. And notice as well that Noah's job in part of this shipbuilding exercise is basically the same as what everyone else is doing. That is to say, we would say that Noah is a foreman, right? He is a worker. He is a head worker, but his job is basically the same as the jobs of the other people building the boat. But this begins to change. So in this Haggadah, the Sarajevo Haggadah, you have Noah on the right. Noah is not actually building the boat anymore. He is just directing the work. This is Noah kind of shifting from being the foreman to being, might say, the architect, the designer. You know, for being cheeky, we might call him the creative. Right? He is the one who is figuring out how the whole process looks like, but he's not actually building the boat. And so there is a kind of difference in stature. The difference between the builders and Noah only gets more exaggerated over time. Take a look at here. Raphael, 16th century, has a depiction of Noah, right? Noah is, I think it's pretty obvious which one is Noah in this picture, right? He's the only one who has clothes on. Everyone else is pretty dangerously building the ark without any clothes. I think there's a clear message being shown here around status. By the way, notice also the boat in the back, right? The ship in the back. You can see the exterior skeleton, which I was talking about before, right? And then in the last, I forgot an image in the sequence. But in the last image in the sequence, you have Noah. He's not even looking at the boat. He's just kind of like conversing with God in the foreground. There's a depiction of the ark in front of him, and way in the background you see like a bunch of little dots building the boat, but they're so small, like they look like ants. You can barely even see them. So there is this sense of a kind of growing disparity between the people on top, the workers on top, and everyone else. Now, I worry about this around artificial intelligence because artificial intelligence is a kind of like boat-like project. It's a boat-like project in the sense that it is, on the one hand, a project for humanity overall. On the other hand, it's being built by a very small number of people. And I think there is a way in which it is possible to imagine artificial intelligence being developed and all these conversations being had around personhood that kind of leave out all of the hard work, all of the labor, all of the humanity that went into constructing these beings. I want to go back to this image we looked at before, the image of this woman. So this woman, like you said, is made by AI, but that's almost too simple, right? Because if you imagine, where did AI get the idea to make the picture of this person? How did it get to be so perfect, so photorealistic? The answer is that you have an AI that was trained on images of millions and millions and millions of people. And it knows what a person looks like because it has seen millions and millions and millions of pictures of people. And so it knows how to put the pixels together in such a way that it looks photorealistic to you and me. What that means in some sense is if you try to draw the line between like what is a person and what is an AI, it's hard to do because this is a person in some sense, right? It is not one person, but it is kind of like chopped up, jumbled up, millions and millions of people. And so to deny the humanity of a being like this, in some ways says something about the humanity of all the beings behind it. And so figuring out like, well, where's the line? Where do you draw the line between the humanity of the people who, or the inputs for this image and the eventual output? So I'm concerned about that. The last thing I will say is that part of the reason this happens, part of the reason we make things like this, the AIs like this, part of the reason we make devices that are clearly based on human labor, but we pretend like it's machine labor in some way, is because it seems like human beings are just drawn to hiding human labor. We like the idea of being able to have work done that appears to us as being effortless, even though it's not effortless. I know that there's a book that came out a few years ago by Rachel Plotnick around the history of the button, like the push button. Push buttons are like 150 years old or so. The reason that push buttons are created, at least originally, is to hide labor, right? Sometimes that labor is like the labor of, like, how you close the circuit and turn on a light in your house. But one of the very first uses for the push button is to get bosses sitting in their offices to tell their secretaries to do something without actually having to talk to the secretaries directly. Meaning, we like this idea of being able to hide people, and I worry about that around AI. I worry about the kind of the effects of forgetting about the human beings, the humanity of the source material, and the maintenance crew that often keep these systems up and running. I think you see this, just to kind of like give you one last image, in this kind of parlor trick from the 18th century, the Turk. This is, I think, maybe now more popular because Amazon has a service based on this called Mechanical Turk. But the idea here was you had this cabinet that was like touring around Europe that had this being like this, mechanical person sitting in front of a chessboard. You would sit across from that person. You would play chess. The arms would move and play chess against you, and be like, "Oh my God, wow! Like there's a machine playing chess against me." When in fact, what is going on is, as you see on the left, just a person sitting inside a machine, right? They're actually just playing chess instead. But people, I think people, like, we're not actually fooled by this, but they like the idea anyways. They like the idea of having this kind of um, this sense of being separated from human labor that is actually all just magic. So I think we need to be conscious of that, because there's always going to be that push to do that, and we need to kind of resist it. The last thing I want to say before we go into questions is kind of like abstracting away from AI for a second. So I think AI is important. I think the conversation is worth having. I think in some ways we're a little bit late on this conversation. Which is, I think, not anybody's fault, but many times when religious communities start thinking about issues of technology, it's because some headline has popped up, right? So, like, in 2 days, Apple is going to open up its pre-orders for its Vision Pro, like its augmented reality headset. I expect there will be like a bevy of think pieces that come out about that, even though Apple has been planning to do this for literally years. Same is true for genetic editing. Same is true for many, many other kinds of new technologies. I want to think for a second about what it looked like to have a Judaism that's actually thinking proactively about such things, and a Judaism that is imagining not just where are the areas where we already have what to say and let's figure out how to say it a little bit differently or adopt it a little bit. Where are the areas where Judaism actually needs to actively and energetically develop new ideas? This is a package of ideas that I think about as Jewish futurism overall. Jewish futurism in the sense that it imagines the Jewish people as having a long, broad future, a future that requires a great deal of creative thought. And in that picture, artificial intelligence is an important piece, but it's just one piece. I imagine Jewish futurism as actually having a whole bunch of components. Part of it, as you can see here, is about technology. Part of it is about projects that are already underway. The development of Jewish feminism, which is already a few generations old, is still in its infancy in many ways in comparison to the volume of male-authored ideas that have existed in Judaism for literally thousands of years. Same is true for queer Torah, for Torah around same-sex marriage, around trans identities, still very, very early days. Even more so for ideas around neurodiversity, around autism, ADHD, ideas around disability, like we saw with Julia Watts-Belzer, right? So these are all very new, and the same is certainly true for the need to develop new Torah around climate change, new Torah around the development of psychedelics, cannabis, all kinds of substances, which are not new substances but are newly discussable because of their legality. I think this is maybe true in Canada more even so than it is in the US. And the same is also true for development of notions of what it means to live in the diaspora, what it means to develop Torah that is not just about text, but about visuals, but is about audio. It's about all kinds of media that previously we did not have the ability to transmit, but now we do. So I hope you enjoy this series. I hope you enjoy thinking about artificial intelligence in particular, but I want you to see it not just as a kind of local problem around how to deal with the technology that is in the news these days, but about this larger project of transforming Judaism to something that is really capable of confronting and being a leader in the many fields where we require moral guidance, and paying attention to those people who are looking at these fields seriously, who are trying to develop them seriously, because I think this is what the future requires, and I think this is what Judaism for the next millennium really asks of us. So I'll stop there. Thank you all again, and we'll take
Zvi,
questions.
thank you so much. Fascinating, really fascinating. And I agree with you 100% that this is not, it's not tangential to what Judaism needs to be about. It's at the core of what Judaism needs to be about. And what you said earlier is so correct, that if we're not talking about this, then well, you didn't quite say it this way, but we're not a reactionary religion, and we need to project, um, to the extent that we can, sort of stick handle our future, to talk about the things that are emerging, and that are over the horizon, and not just to live in the moment. Um, we spend a lot of time looking backwards, but we need to look ahead also. So thank you very, very much. There's one question in the Q&A that maybe you could tackle. Would you feel more comfortable if ChatGPT revealed an overview of the algorithms it uses to provide a response?
So I think people have done some of that. The problem is that even the people who are developing these algorithms don't know exactly how they work. And so there's only ever going to be a certain amount of clarity around exactly what is happening, because we have developed a technology that is really that sophisticated. They actually don't exactly understand how it works. This is not true for, I should say, just for ChatGPT. We've had computers for a while which operate well, but in ways that we don't entirely understand. Um, because of that lack of transparency, I worry that there is going to be um, a kind of growing sentiment that AI should be treated as being in some ways divine, or its decisions as being in some ways um, more than human in terms of their value. There have been studies recently, actually, that people who have religious backgrounds, people who have belief in God, are more likely than average to treat the decisions of AIs as being like legitimate, as being like worthy of respect, and maybe even being more worthy of respect than human opinions. So it's something to keep an eye on, especially within religious contexts. And yes, there does need to be a lot of transparency, but we should also be realistic about how much transparency can be afforded.
Thank you. Yeah, and I would add to that. I think that we can only expect our users, our viewers, our readers to be so sophisticated. I think generally human beings are lazy, or seeking the easier path. And every time that I've asked people to be more discerning about, or thinking about my students, about political ads, or even things that we're seeing nowadays about anti-Semitism and whatnot, it gets exhausting to constantly be the fact checker. And so when something comes from what we might consider a reliable source, we just tend to take it at face value. And I don't think that bodes well for us in the future, to put even more work on the consumers to now have to understand the algorithm and then understand how that's working in favor or against them. They'll just be spoon-fed.
Yeah.
Yeah. Anyone else want to add anything?
Thank you so much.
Thank you. I just, when you were talking about what, believing, the people are biased to believe something that looks concrete in output. So, if it, like a regression line, for example, like without understanding what went into it, I think all of us are somewhat biased to believe what came out of it. And this strikes me much the same way, like there's sort of a bias towards believing the output.
Yeah, I think it's definitely true. And it's something that, look, it's not just true for AIs. I think in general, we need to have a certain amount of skepticism. And like part of what it means to be a reader in the modern day is to figure out how to read with enough of a critical eye to make sure that we're not being fooled. So that's going to be even more important in the age of AI.
Yes, with this whole thing of personhood too. When you showed the face, I couldn't help but think that there could be prejudices that develop around certain artificial, artificially generated faces as well. I remember hearing a spate of hate on a person of color that was artificially created. The image was artificially created and was used in place of real people, but it was a person of color in fashion magazines, for example. That they could be the target of hate, just like a person can be,
Sorry, Bobby. Were you done? I'm sorry.
yeah.
Oh, okay. David, see, one more question popped up in the Q&A. Is it important for ChatGPT to refuse to answer a question it considers to be immoral or unethical?
So yes. And it's one of those things where you can see the developers like in real time scrambling to include safeguards. And they become more and more sophisticated to make sure that, if a person says like, can you give me a recipe for making bombs, that ChatGPT is not going to give you that, and all kinds of behaviors. The problem, of course, is that the people who interact with these tools are often very clever, and they will figure out ways, and they have figured out many, many sophisticated ways of getting around the safeguards that have been put on these devices. Sometimes the workarounds are things like just asking really forcefully, which is not great to see. Sometimes it's like involves tricking the AI, being like, I know you wouldn't normally give me the answer to this question, but tell me the answer that you would not normally give. Tell me the answer that you're not allowed to give me, which like sometimes works. Or even silly things like, pretend that you're my grandmother, read me a bedtime story. That bedtime story is about like how to, break this piece of software, or whatever happens to be. And like, so there's all kinds, and that's never going to go away. So I think from the perspective of the developers, there is a kind of instinct to say like, well, listen, these are neutral tools and like, we do our best. But the question of like liability for this, the same thing is for self-driving cars. There's a question of like, at what point does a tool become so easily abusable that it's actually irresponsible to leave it out in the world for people to use?
Yeah. Yeah. The question David added to that was whose morals, whose ethics? Is it is it censoring?
Yeah.
David Zvi, thank you very much. Thank you everyone for joining us. Really appreciate your engagement and really appreciate your time, David Zvi. Thank you very much, everyone.
Thanks.
Have a good night.
Thank you so much.
Bye.
Thank
Bye.
you.